reading, "I'm sure nothing can be done with this," was enclosed in a plastic bag with these many pieces of this shattered statue of Jesus. It is in an old Spanish style following the scourging, and it depicts Christ's wounds quite graphically. It's similar also to a statue that was kept by Saint Brother Andre. If you've been to St. Joseph's Oratory in Montreal, you know that they've recreated his study the way he kept it. And on his desk is a statue very similar to this. We're looking forward to putting these pieces back together, including the sculpting wire to hold the statue more firmly together when it is repaired. We will attach all the pieces that we can which fit, and when we see the spots where there are either missing pieces or the pieces are too small to be of use, we will resculpt that with new plaster. Then we'll prepare the statue and get it ready for the artistic stage. After examining the many pieces to sort the usable from the unusable pieces, the first stage is to start reattaching the smaller pieces and wiping off excess glue. The small crack lines don't matter much for the moment, since at this stage we're just reassembling. We mix very small batches of the glue, since the larger segments will have to be held in place for a few minutes, and while the upper torso binds firmly in place, any remaining pre-mixed epoxy will start to harden and can't be used anyway. Here, the original sculpting wires are reinserted into the existing holes, helping ensure the upper body is firm in its correct position. The goal is to preserve as much of the original statue as possible before moving to add new plaster. With very few of the usable pieces remaining, we see some places here, like on the side, for example, we know that this piece is going to fit. Some of the others we're simply going to recast. On the chest, you'll see quite a number of the pieces, probably 8 or 10 pieces we were able to put back together. The rest we will recast using this plaster called Hydrocal. You mix it with water, and then using some of these tools, we're going to simply smooth it out and recreate as much as we can the original statue. Now that much of the area that can be repaired on the surface with new plaster has been done, you can see, for example, on the chest and up here on the forearm, it is pretty much smoothed out and almost ready for us to begin the artistic portion. On the front, around the chest, I'm using a 2-part epoxy material for sculpting because it's firmer and more easy to work with the sculpting tool. So that'll come onto the chest, and I'll show you momentarily what it looks like once that sculpting has been done and we move on to the next stage. The epoxy sculpt has now hardened, and we're going to just sand off the surface a little bit to get it prepared for the undercoating and the painting. You can see here we've tried to recreate wounds and the flaps of skin very similar to the original sculpture. When we finish the sanding, we'll begin the process of priming and then repainting. All of the small areas here where there are little paint chips will be gently smoothed out with sandpaper, and then I don't wear gloves because you need to be able to feel the ridges and make sure that the surface is actually smooth to hold the new coats of paint. Sanding is by hand, trying to get right into the crevices and the little corners and edges. This particular statue was sculpted by the Tommaso Carli Company of Montreal, a fantastic old statuary long since out of business, trying to clean up the name without losing it, then repairing the chipped off corners. We're at a stage now where fine sanding of even the smallest paint chips, we want to try to make that whole area smooth so that when we apply the primer and the paint, these repairs will actually be fairly invisible. So that you can see on the base, the chip is now completely smooth. We've also done underneath, we've tried to do some repair on some of the edges, but because there is some inscription written down here and it's old, we wanted to try to preserve that as much as possible because of the personal value to the statue's owner. We've redone some of the wounds, which you'll see when it's repainted. A piece of the arm had been broken off and missing, a little bit of the binding rope around Jesus's wrist. And as we move around some of the sides, you can also see sections of the throat that had been broken off. This entire area in the back was actually a gaping hole because it didn't quite match up. So we've resculpted that with the epoxy sculpt that I mentioned to you earlier. We'll smooth out a couple more of the wounds that are a bit jagged, and then we'll be ready to get to the primer and the final painting stage.
From a palette of many skin tones, the primary layer of paint is intended to hide the repair lines where the epoxy and the new plaster connect to the original work. A fine-tipped brush helps me to get into the crevices and all the folds to make sure that nothing is left unpainted. A variation of shades will make the skin tones look more realistic, and then the delicate task of recreating wounds in the original artist's style. This is a very graphic depiction of the scourging of Jesus, and many priests and religious have asked us to paint statues or crucifixes in this style. They use it for a deeper contemplation on Christ's passion. With the base also rebuilt and repainted, the statue that came to us in very poor condition is completed and ready to return to its owner.